cooperation between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland?
Thank you. Well, the Chancellor's answer shows that just like Parliament, he's treated us with contempt and has been treated by contempt with the PM and has been brushed aside. So I ask him again, in the national interest, not the Tory party interest or his own interest, at what point will he break cover and use the powers in Section 31 of the Act, which he initiated and his ministers guided through Parliament? I ask him when he is going to implement those powers, or is this just another Tory parliamentary sham?
Mr. Speaker, those powers are there specifically to deal with the customs union that we will need to create with the Crown dependencies, not for the purpose that the honourable gentleman is suggesting.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've been listening to this Treasury questions carefully, and it strikes me that from all opposition parties we hear pleas that business wants to end uncertainty. And at the same time, members of the opposition parties have been deliberately seeking to provoke chaos by not supporting the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement. Would the Chancellor agree with me that by doing this, they are playing political games with the lives and jobs of the British people?
So true. I know the honourable gentleman was trying very hard, but forgive me, and I say this by way of kindly counsel to the honourable gentleman who's a new member, but questions must be about the policies of the government, as the clerk swivelled round to remind me, not about the policies or tactics of the opposition. So we'll leave that there and come to Helen Goodman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Further to the answer that the Chancellor of the Exchequer just gave to my honourable friend, last week the Father of the House pointed out that if we were to be in a customs union, we would need to have the same regulatory standards as the Europeans. And that's true because they fear unfair competition through a regulatory race to the bottom. So if the Prime Minister does not succeed today, will the Chancellor revisit this option?
Mr. Speaker, I'm very confident that my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, will succeed in the mission that she's undertaking today, and I look forward to her reporting back to the House with the progress that she's made.
Priti Patel.
Speaker, lower taxes and a simplified tax system are crucial to long-term economic growth and competition. Will the Chancellor look at introducing new tax reforms in the future, including combining income tax and national insurance to improve the efficiency of our tax system?
Well, I entirely agree with my right honourable friend on the importance of low taxes, which is why under this government, Mr. Speaker, on corporation tax we've had reductions from 28% down to 19%. That will go down further to 17%. And on income tax, of course, through our increase in the personal allowance announced in the budget, bringing that forward, we've taken about 4 million of the lowest paid out of tax altogether. On her specific point, Mr. Speaker, of the alignment of national insurance and income tax, that is a very complex thing to do. There will be a considerable number of losers as well as some gainers. It is something that the Office of Tax Simplification has looked at in the past, and it is something that we will keep under review as we go.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given this country's £5.9 billion net trading surplus with the EU in insurance, will the Chancellor take the opportunity of the demise of the withdrawal agreement to make financial services a part of the Prime Minister's next attempt at a Brexit deal?
Well, the City are very content with the deal that we have on financial services, where we would seek enhanced and we would secure enhanced equivalence decisions 6 months before the end of the implementation period, and the degree of dialogue and support from the City has been constant throughout.
Stephen Kerr.
Mr. Speaker, given the £900 million of additional funding for the Scottish Block grant announced in the budget, what discussions has the Chancellor had with the SNP Scottish Government about following his example and cutting business rates?
Well, my honourable friend makes a very good point. I have regular meetings with the Scottish Finance Secretary, and of course in their budget tomorrow they've got an opportunity to match the business rate cuts that we have done in England.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I met ABTA, the Travel Association, this morning, and they had two requests for the Chancellor. One, that he rules out no deal because implementing no-deal preparations for their smaller members potentially puts them out of business. And secondly, he wanted to hear from the Chancellor and from the government when the immigration paper was going to be available, because without it they can make no business plans.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think I have been perfectly clear and consistent in expressing the view that no deal would be a very bad outcome for this country, and I will do everything I can to make sure that that is not an outcome we face. On the question of the government's future migration policy, a white paper will be published shortly.
Zach Goldsmith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When criticising a Labour budget in 2005, my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, said, and I quote, "A taxpayer is entitled to be protected from retrospective or retroactive legislation. But through the 2019 loan charge, that is precisely what HMRC is now doing to thousands of people who acted in good faith and in accordance with the rules at the time. Can I urge my right honourable friend once again to not backdate the charge to before 2017?
I thank my honourable friend for his question, but I have to fundamentally disagree with him. The arrangements that have been entered into around disguised remuneration and for which the loan charge is being applied were always defective at the time that they were being used. They have been taken through the courts on many times over many years by HMRC and been found to be defective. They also went through, in a particular case, the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, and the scheme was found to be defective. So this is not a retrospective measure, but it is a question of tax fairness. And of course, those that are involved can come forward and have discussions with HMRC, who, where there are difficulties around payment, will be sympathetic and will enter into time to pay arrangements to make sure that those people are protected as well as paying the right tax.
P. Jones.
Mr. Speaker, IPPR's North's analysis has shown that in the South there is £326 per head spending on infrastructure, whilst at only £156 per person in the North. And small towns like in my constituency have been hit the hardest with lack of infrastructure, withdrawal of public sector services. Now we find out this week the third bailout for Crossrail 2 costing £2.1 billion, the government is simply going to give them a cheque. When is the North West going to get £2.1 billion equivalents?
Well, first of all, Mr. Speaker, I should make clear that the additional support we're providing to Crossrail is in the form of a loan that will be repaid to the government by London. So it is London taxpayers and London fare payers that will meet the cost of the overrun. The North West is now the second highest region in the UK for transport investment. Per capita investment has risen from £648 per year between 06-07 and 09-10 to £1,129 a year between 14-15 and 17-18.
Ryan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's very welcome that today's figures show that wages are rising, unemployment's falling, and we've got a record number of people in work. But we still need more good jobs in Leicestershire. So when the Leicestershire Industrial Strategy comes forward with exciting plans to boost the life sciences and small satellite manufacturing, will the Treasury look closely at getting behind it?
The Treasury will look very closely at it, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, at our border we need to make sure we've got security, we're securing freedom of movement of goods and people, and we're gaining revenue. The head of HMRC has said it will be almost impossible to do all those three things if we crash out without a deal. While the Chancellor keeps talking about a deal, we're just over 100 days away from potentially crashing out. So what conversations is he having to make sure that we're not hit in the pocket because of a lack of revenue as a result?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we have made clear that we will prioritise, first of all, the security of the UK, and then we will prioritise flow of trade. We will not prioritise the collection of customs tariffs. And the Honourable Lady will be aware, of course, that these are tariffs we are not currently collecting. They would be additional revenues. We will treat that as something that we can do in slower time if the situation arises.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Later today, the House will debate fuel poverty. Does the Chancellor agree with me that the greatest lever that we can pull to alleviate the challenge of fuel poverty is by incentivising home energy efficiency? And will he look at what the Treasury can do to address that?
Well, it's certainly one of the levers that we can pull, and I'm very happy to look again at how we support home energy efficiency.
Gareth Thomas.
When will the government bring forward proposals to allow well-funded credit unions to provide low-cost credit cards, low-cost car loans, and to invest in other social programmes such as energy cooperatives or housing schemes?
Following on from the budget, what I can commit to the honourable gentleman is that we have a series of measures to assist credit unions to expand their role in delivering affordable credit across communities. We have a scheme of work over the next 3 months to pilot interest-free loans and prize loans to prize saving to actually help them to grow as they have been doing in recent years.
Joe Johnson.
Speaker, what does the government make of the Centre for European Reform report this week that warned of a 60% fall in UK financial services exports to the EU in the event we lose access to the single market and put in place a free trade agreement in its place?
I think what I would say is that the City remain very concerned to secure a deal in order to maximise the strong relationship that we have with the EU and the rest of the world at the same time.
Jim Cunningham.
Much, Mr. Speaker. Can the Chancellor tell us what impact Brexit is going to have on universities, particularly in Coventry, but more importantly, universities do projects from Europe, and equally they work closely with the manufacturing industry, like Jaguar Land Rover. What we're going to do about it?
Well, our university sector is a vital asset to the UK, and over the last decade I think we've seen the universities working much more closely together with industry in a relationship which is having a very positive and advantageous effect on the growth profile and the technology uptake in the economy. As we leave the European Union, it is vitally important that our universities are able to go on exchanging students and teaching staff with European institutions. We will do everything we can to ensure that that happens.
I think we should hear from my favourite estate agent, Mr. Kevin Hoddinrake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Banks guilty of the scandalous mistreatment of small businesses are allowed to design and oversee their own redress schemes, including determining the level of compensations paid to the victims. Does my honourable friend agree that Parliament and the regulator should take control of these processes?
Well, I've always said that the banks need to do more to restore their relationship with SMEs, and I welcome the scheme that UK Finance have announced to address unresolved historic complaints. I look forward to meeting with my honourable friend next week with the Chancellor to discuss the government's position.
Jamie Stone.
Mr. Speaker, the Inverness and Highlands City deal was agreed a little while ago, and that's very good news. A whole shed load of money has been spent in Inverness, well done Inverness, but precious little has been spent in the outlying areas, for instance Wick and Thurso. That is surely not in the spirit of the deal, and should there not be an audit of this sort of deal in future?
We are doing city deals right across Scotland. They are having huge benefits for the local economy. And we've also announced in the budget a freeze in whisky duty. The question now is, how are the Scottish Government going to respond to that in their budget tomorrow? Are they going to cut income tax? And are they also going to cut business rates?
How many more trees will be planted as a result of investment in the recent budget?
A very large number, Mr. Speaker. And I will go back to the Treasury now and write to my honourable friend with a precise figure.
Can I very politely suggest to the Chancellor that if he were to lodge a copy of his reply with the requisite statistical information in the library of the House, I don't say that he will be garlanded, but he might come close to it. Emma Hardy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the Minister will be as concerned as I am to hear the words of the Chief Inspector for Ofsted, Amanda Spielman, tell us that the sustainability and quality of our further education colleges is being hit by cuts to funding. So what I asked the Minister today is, could he, instead of doing an impression of the Grinch, instead be our Father Christmas and give our FE colleges the funding and presents they want for Christmas?
Very accurate.
We have protected the funding of FE colleges since 2015. We're also investing £500 million in T-levels and improved technical education, and we're seeing more low-income students going to university and getting high-quality apprenticeships.
Court! Mr. Speaker, I welcome the extra £1 billion for the armed forces that was invested in the budget. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that it's only this government's sensible management of the economy that has made this possible?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, you can't have strong defence without a strong economy.
Ruth George.
Thank you very much. Royal Bank of Scotland in the next 2 months will close all but 56 branches in cities across England, leaving banking deserts across towns and rural areas like mine. What is the Chancellor doing to use the government's shareholding to exert public pressure on the Royal Bank of Scotland and to make sure we have no banking deserts?
The government holds a 62.3% shareholding, but we don't run the bank. Decisions on the branch network will be a matter for the bank.
Sir Oliver Hill.
Is he aware that Sir Johnson Matthey in my constituency, one of the most successful companies in our country, is committed to having a fair deal for us to do Brexit, not a no deal, because they feel it's vital that it should be an orderly retreat and not chaos? And does he agree with me that that's what the Prime Minister's deal would achieve?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and that is indeed the expressed view of the vast majority of businesses in this country.
Debbie Abraham.
Will the Chancellor work with the Cabinet and Business Secretaries to support my 10-minute rule bill on project bank accounts for government projects, which will protect small businesses from losses when Tier 1 suppliers such as Carillion and Interserve collapse?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm very happy to look further at the honourable lady's bill. It is an interesting idea, and I know that the Cabinet Office Commercial Secretariat has been looking at the proposal she's put forward.
Thank you. Order. We must move on. Urgent question, Yvette Cooper.
To ask the Attorney-General to make a statement about the government's obligations under Section 13 of the Withdrawal Act.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I recognise that this question, which was the subject of much discussion and some speculation yesterday, and so I hope to be able to put honourable members and the right honourable ladies' concerns at ease. Put simply, in keeping with the clear intention of the EU Withdrawal Act 2018, the government will ensure that the question of whether to accept an agreement is brought back to this House before the 21st of January. If Parliament accepts that deal, we will introduce the EU Withdrawal Agreement Bill to implement the withdrawal agreement in domestic legislation. If Parliament were to reject the deal, the government will be required to make a statement on its proposed next steps and table a motion in neutral terms on that statement. Following the passage of the amendment to the Business of the House motion last week, that motion would be amendable. So it is our clear intention that this House will consider this matter before the 21st of January and have the opportunity to decide on the deal. But let me also say this clearly. In the unlikely and highly undesirable circumstances that as of the 21st of January there is no deal before the House, the government would bring a statement to the House and arrange for a debate as specified by the law. I am confident that we will have a deal that this House can support, and I hope that the statement puts the rest of the concerns of honourable members about the government's commitment to meet the spirit as well as the letter of the Withdrawal Act and to respect the will of this House.
Yvette Cooper.
I thank the Minister for those assurances, but also say to him that in the current circumstances, those are not enough. The reason that I asked this question to the Attorney-General is because we need to know the government's legal interpretation of Section 13 of the Act, and also to be assured that legally the government will abide by the spirit of that Act as well. Because now that the government has pulled the vote, we don't know when a vote will come or even whether a vote will come on the deal. Number 10 official spokesman said this morning that it will come by the 21st of January, and the Minister said it would come by the 21st of January. However, yesterday morning, the Environment Secretary, who is sitting on the front bench, told us and confirmed that the vote was 100% going to happen. And yesterday at 11 o'clock, number 10 spokesperson said the vote is going ahead. By 3:30, the Prime Minister had pulled it.
Chaos.
These warm words are therefore not enough when so much is at stake. Who knows? And this goes for the Cabinet and all of the benches opposite as well. None of us know whether the Prime Minister is going to pull the vote again or whether she is even going to table a vote on the deal again. So if we get to the 21st of January and there is no deal, the agreement of Parliament was that the government should make a statement and Parliament should be able to vote on it and that it should be amendable. Now,
the Minister said that if, in the unlikely event, there is no deal, that would happen. However, we need urgent assurance from the Attorney-General that the government will not find a loophole in this by saying that there is a deal, even though we haven't voted on it, and thereby avoiding the requirements of Section 13, subsections 7 to 11, which would require the vote by the 21st of January. So, in other words, by never quite getting round to offering a vote on this deal until it is too late, but also not having a vote on no deal, keeping us in limbo. No vote on the deal and no vote on no deal. If the government were to do this, it would be a constitutional outrage. It would be upending the spirit of the Withdrawal Agreement Act, but much worse, it would be letting the country either drift or forcing the country into no deal without a parliamentary vote. So we need written assurances from the Attorney-General on the government's interpretation of the Act, and we need that assurance that even if there has been no vote on this deal, even if they're still claiming that the deal applies, if there has been a no vote on the deal by the 21st of January, then the government will still abide by Section 13, subsections 7 to 11, and ensure there is a statement and an amendable vote on its plans, including whether or not this means no deal, and that will happen under any circumstances by the 21st of January. Now, I make no apology, Mr. Speaker, for my purpose in doing this. I already think that the 21st of January is far too late for businesses and departments who will already be thinking that they've got to chuck everything at preparing for no deal. But I want to stop this country careering into no deal, either by accident or by deliberate intention of the government, with all of the damaging consequences for jobs, for prosperity and for our national security, without Parliament having a say and without Parliament being able to stop that happening. Even if other members do not agree with me in that purpose, I hope they will agree that this Parliament cannot be ignored, and that is why we need the Attorney-General's written advice.
Well, I have great respect for the Right Honourable Lady, and I understand that she came to this House expecting to have a row about the government's interpretation of this, and I understand the questions that she has just asked. But what I would say is I have responded to this question as my department is responsible for the legislation which enacts this, and which I have given her a very clear interpretation of that legislation, which is that we will have a vote in this House, a motion before this House by the 21st of January. And that is in all those different scenarios that I talked through in my statement. So the answer is very clear for her. We respect the decisions which were made by this House, that the government should come back to the House with a motion in the event that no deal had been agreed, or in the event that this House had rejected a deal. That was clear from my statement. What we are therefore saying is that there will be that motion by the 21st of January, and I agree with her. I would much rather, and I fully expect it to be sooner. And I fully expect this House to have the opportunity to debate a withdrawal agreement that this House will be able to support. And so let us work together to achieve that, but let us not allow some of the conspiracy theories and the scare stories that have been told about this to run away when I have just clarified the government's position.
Nicky Morgan.
Very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. I have great sympathy for the points made by both the Minister, who I think is acting with integrity, as he always has done in his parliamentary career, but also for the points made by the Honourable Lady. It is unquestionable that this Parliament must have a say, a meaningful vote on the deal or no deal that comes about. Can the Minister give categorical assurance that there will be no trickery by the government to stop Parliament having a say?
No trickery. Well, Minister, my right honourable friend, and I'm grateful for her words. I'm very happy to give that categorical assurance. As I think my statement reflected, we will be putting before Parliament a motion, even in the circumstances where no deal was before the House. But I strongly believe and expect that there will be a deal before this House, which I will be urging Parliament to support.
Nick Thomas-Symonds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, the member for Normanton, Pontefract and Castleford, for applying for this urgent question, and to you, Mr. Speaker, for granting it. I'm grateful to the Minister's response, but the reality is that the Attorney-General should be here to speak about the legal implications of this agreement. Yesterday, the Prime Minister used the phrase, in this House, of an accidental no deal. That she used the phrase is itself evidence of a dereliction of leadership, Mr. Speaker. Section 13 of the European Withdrawal Act is therefore crucial in this House being able to prevent a chaotic no-deal outcome which would do enormous damage to our security, our economy and our society. So can the Minister answer these questions? The Prime Minister's official spokesperson has reiterated today that the Government will bring back the meaningful vote by the 21st of January. Isn't it completely contrary to the national interest for the Prime Minister to run down another 6 weeks on the clock when all she is seeking is reassurances and clarification on a document that Parliament already understands? And if we are relying on the Government's word, or to use the Minister's phrase, its clear intention that the Government will keep the 21st of January deadline, rather than the clear force of the law, doesn't the Minister understand that this week of all weeks that constitutes no reassurance at all? Yesterday, the Prime Minister was unable to properly answer questions about the legal force of the 21st of January deadline, and the Leader of the House could not properly answer questions about the legal status and force of the amendment of the Right Honourable and Learned Gentleman for Beaconsfield. Let me just say, the reassurance that was just given by the Minister means nothing without the legal backing of the Attorney-General, who isn't here. Isn't the truth, Mr. Speaker, that this decision to pull the vote was made in a panicked haste without thinking through the economic, political and constitutional implications for our country?
Mr. Walker.
Well, the honourable gentleman made my point very clearly when he said that, yes, the Prime Minister's spokesman has said the same thing as I said this morning from the dispatch box, that there will be such a meaningful vote before the House before the 21st of January. He also talked about acting contrary to the national interest, and I think we're very clear on what acting contrary to the national interest is Labour's approach of blindly opposing sensible steps that are taken by the government to secure a deal while proposing no alternatives.
Get your retaliation in early. Mr. Dominic Grieve.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to my honourable friend for his statement. Can I just pick him up on a couple of points? The first one is this. Section 13 procedure presupposes that the government has an initialed deal with the European Union. And of course we have such an initialed deal, which is why we started debate on it last week for the purpose of deciding whether the House should or should not approve it. In those circumstances, can he provide an assurance to the House that if the initial deal is continuing in its current form, then in those as initialed, the House can complete its consideration not on a day just before the 21st of January, but expeditiously, as was clearly provided for under the Act. Secondly, may I also take it from what he said that the government now accepts that the amendment that was tabled to the procedure under Section 13 to allow for amendable motions thereafter is now fully accepted by the government as it should prevail in future?
Minister.
Yes, and I commend my right honourable and learned friend for the points that he's raised. I agree with him. I have given that commitment from the dispatch box with regard to his amendment there, and that does mean that the motion would be amendable. And with regard to the government, the House being able to complete its considerations expeditiously, I think we all have that in mind. I think the Prime Minister has made clear her determination to seek out those assurances, listening to the concerns that have been raised in the House, and then to come back swiftly to this House so that we can complete those considerations.
Joanna Cherry.
Mr. Speaker, this is a government which has been found in contempt of Parliament and which continues to demonstrate its contempt for parliamentary democracy on a daily basis. It's clear that the government prefers to communicate with MPs through the lobby briefings than on the floor of this House. And it's also clear that the government is trying to evade its legal responsibilities by failing to have the Attorney-General here to answer this question and putting the Minister up. I see the Solicitor-General is on the front bench and engaged in anxious conversation. Why wasn't he put up to answer this question? Mr. Speaker, it's been made very clear in the last 24 hours by many member states of the European Union and by Jean-Claude Juncker and Donald Tusk that there is no question of any meaningful renegotiation. So can I ask the Minister now for a cast-iron guarantee that the initial deal will be brought back to this House for a vote before the 21st of January, and if so, on what date, and that motion will be amendable? And if he can't give me that cast-iron guarantee, will he look seriously at the possibility of putting this deal to the people of the 4 nations of the United Kingdom to see whether they want this deal or whether they would prefer to stay in the European Union on our current terms and conditions, as the Court of Justice made clear is possible yesterday?
Minister. The honourable and learned lady, of course, should pay attention to what I already said in my statement, which is that we will be bringing a motion before the House, either, as I would much prefer, on this deal, with the assurances that the Prime Minister will by then have one, so that this House can vote on that, or, even in the circumstances where that were not on the table, we would be bringing a motion back before the House. But I say to her, she raises the idea of a people's vote once again, and we very clearly had a people's vote. We had that people's vote across the whole of the United Kingdom in 2016. It is our duty as members of this House to deliver on that.
Sir Oliver Letwin.
I'm very grateful to the Minister for his clarifications, but can I press him on one point that I don't think he covered? If there is, under Section 13(8), a statement at some point before the 21st of January, as there must be under that section, if the Prime Minister has by then concluded that she cannot complete a deal, is he confirming that that statement will be accompanied by a motion which, though in neutral terms, will be amendable? Or did his point about the amendment cover only a statement of motion under sections 13(1) and 13(4)?
Well, Minister. Right honourable friend is typically meticulous in his questioning. My understanding is that the intention of the House in passing that motion is that it should be amendable in all 3 cases set out in section 13.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. I'm afraid the Minister, for whom I have great respect, has not wholly succeeded in his aim of providing reassurance to the House, because what we learned yesterday is that today's assurances can disappear tomorrow like a puff of wind. Now, can he clarify the following? If the withdrawal agreement comes back, the government says it will, before the 21st of January, and is defeated, then legally speaking, for the purposes of Section 13 of the EU Withdrawal Act 2018, is there still agreement in principle with the European Union? This is a very important point in view of the previous question that was asked, because even if it is defeated, for the purposes of the Act, the only thing it refers to as agreement in principle has been reached. Now, the Prime Minister, the government said on the, I think it was the 28th of November, agreement in principle has been reached. So can you just clarify that that remains the case even if the withdrawal agreement is defeated?
Minister. I have great respect for the right honourable gentleman, the work that he does on the Select Committee, but I have to say in this case I don't share his interpretation. I think Section 13 is very clear in looking at scenarios where either a deal had not been reached or if a deal had been voted down, then a statement would be required, and that is my understanding of the commitment we made. We need to come to this House and have that vote, even in the circumstances that a deal had been brought before this House and turned down.
Jay Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And just to press further on this point, could my honourable friend clarify whether, in light of the Prime Minister's statement yesterday, whether the government still maintains that a political agreement has been reached in line with the statutory statement presented to Parliament on the 26th of November? As things stand today, have we still got a valid initial deal?
Minister.
I think the Prime Minister has been clear that, of course, we have reached an initial deal with the EU, but she has listened to the concerns of this House in going back to seek to discuss that and to seek assurances on that. I think that means that she will want to put before this House a deal with those assurances and to ensure that this House has its meaningful vote on that arrangement.
Angela Eagle.
Mr. Speaker. I have some sympathy for the honourable gentleman because he's doing his best to give us assurances in this House about what's likely to happen. But the fact is that he's appearing here on behalf of a Prime Minister who has completely shredded her credibility by what she did yesterday, who was prepared to send her cabinet colleagues out to make one assertion with confidence in the morning while she was plotting to reverse it at the same time as she had them in front of the TV cameras. Why should we believe a single thing, despite his personal integrity, that the Minister tells us today?
Minister! Well, I have to say to the Honourable Lady that I believe I'm standing here on behalf of a Prime Minister who is seeking to do the right thing for the country, who is seeking to bring us together and seek to secure an agreement that is in our best interest and that this whole House can support.
Maria Miller.
My right honourable friend has been absolutely crystal clear that there will be a meaningful debate, a meaningful vote. Does he share my concern that the benches opposite are more interested in driving damaging uncertainty rather than supporting the Prime Minister, who is trying to deliver the best deal for this country?
Well, frankly, I do share that concern, and I think we see today that there's a focus on process versus outcomes. I think we should all be focused on getting the best outcome from the whole of this process.
Tom Brake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately for the Minister, and I don't think he should take this personally, any assurances this government gives have the half-life of one of those isotopes that we're all so worried about. He must be aware that there will be an absolute uproar in this House if the government try to engineer by trickery or chicanery avoiding having a vote on this deal. But can I ask him, can he give us a categoric assurance that if, as is expected, amendments in support of a people's vote are put to that deal, if we do get to vote on it, the government will not seek to thwart any such amendment and vote?
I have to say to the honourable gentleman that to have from the Liberal Democrats a suggestion of assurances not being worth the paper they're written on is quite strong. But I would also say to him that we have voted many times in this House already on a second referendum, and every time it has been defeated, because clearly the majority of members of this House want to respect the people's vote we had in 2016.
Sir Desmond Swain.
When we get the vote and vote for the agreement, at what stage can we subsequently walk away from trade negotiations should the terms prove sufficiently unattractive?
Minister.
Well, my honourable friend asked me a question which is well beyond the scope of this urgent question, and so I'm not going to attempt to answer it at this time.
Liz Kendall.
Why would anyone believe a word the government says on when the vote will take place, when ministers have spent weeks promising the vote would be today, and when the Prime Minister's only hope of survival is to delay the vote till the last possible minute to try and force MPs to change their minds?
Well, I simply don't agree with the Honourable Lady's narrative. I think that the Prime Minister has been very clear that she has listened to this House, she understands the concerns that there are across this House, and she wants to take those back to European counterparts to make sure that we have the best deal before this House. And she will then bring it back here and she will put it before this House to decide on.
Very engaging wave from the honourable gentleman, the member for Wantage, but it's not a normal means by which to procure the attention of the chair. And it would be a pity to squander the honourable gentleman at such an early stage of our proceedings, so I'll come to him in due course. Dr. Sarah Wollaston.
Thank you. In 108 days, we run out of road, and the only red line that has not been laid down is the one in front of the cliff's edge, falling into a chaotic no deal. Can I urge the Minister and the government to bring forward the meaningful vote to next week, because by then, at least, we will know what cosmetic changes have been made in Brussels.
Right. Well, I'd say gently to my honourable friend, I think we should make sure that the Prime Minister has the opportunity that she seeks to make sure we have the best deal in front of this House, to make sure that we have the assurances in front of this House so that the whole House can get behind it. And she is a great champion of working across party. I think we ought to be taking this forward in a way which is cross-party and that delivers for the whole country. But I don't believe that it would be right, therefore, to rush into having a vote of this nature before we had sought those assurances.
Ben Bradshaw.
But given the fact that the NHS and thousands of businesses across this country are going to have to start implementing their plans for a no-deal contingency before Christmas, wouldn't that be grossly irresponsible? And what possible reason can he give for refusing to hold the rest of the debate and the vote next week?
Well, I'd say to the right honourable gentleman that he should be working with us to provide that certainty and stability that the NHS and many others will by securing the agreement and by securing the implementation period that it provides. I think that will be in the best interests of all those organisations of whom he speaks.
I can't wait any longer to hear the mellifluous tones of the honourable gentleman. Mr. Ed Vasey.
Well, I fear I've raised the bar too high, Mr. Speaker, but I was going to say that it seems unlikely the Prime Minister will get any substantial changes to the withdrawal agreement, and so it is beginning to look like she's withdrawn the vote for her benefit and not for Parliament's benefit. Isn't it time to bring back the withdrawal agreement, have the vote, and then allow Parliament to make a decision? Like the Minister, I do not favour a second referendum. I would like Parliament to reach a conclusion on Brexit.
Minister!
I think we're all clear that Parliament will have its crucial say in this process. That is why I've made this statement, to make it very clear that there will be a meaningful vote before Parliament, and I agree with him that that date of the 21st January is at the back end of when we want to see that. We want to see it come sooner. I'm sure the Prime Minister will be striving to ensure that she can bring it back to this House even sooner than that.
Lisa Nandy.
Considered the withdrawal agreement in good faith, but time after time the Prime Minister has broken her word, and over the last 2.5 years she sought to withhold information not just from this House but from the public about the impact that these different options will have on us. I have businesses in Wigan who aren't bidding for contracts because they don't know if they'll be able to deliver them. I have thousands of food manufacturing jobs at stake, and I have smaller food manufacturing firms who will go under if no deal becomes a political reality. So will he begin to restore some trust in this House from those members of Parliament whose votes the government still supposedly seeks, and tell us today categorically that this government will explore every option, including extending Article 50, before they will allow this country to leave the EU with no deal at all?
I'd say to the Honourable Lady that we have before us an option to make sure that we leave with a negotiated deal with an implementation period. The Prime Minister is seeking to improve that still further to make sure that this House has the best option to move forward in an orderly basis, and that is the route we should take.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I genuinely believe that there are members on the backbenches of the party opposite who, like me, want to avoid a no-deal Brexit or the risks of a very divisive second referendum. So can I urge this Minister, who I know to be a very thoughtful listener, to spend some of the time that has become available in his diary with some of those backbenchers on the party opposite to see if their concerns can be addressed.
Well, I'm always happy to take my honourable friend's advice, and I would certainly be happy to do that.
Right, your own backbenchers.
Pat McFadden.
Mr. Speaker, there are circumstances in which, under Section 13 of the EU Withdrawal Act, the Government is required to make a statement on how to proceed by January the 21st. Those are if the Commons decides not to approve a deal presented by the Government, or if no agreement in principle can be reached. But the House of Commons Library, in its note prepared overnight on this, says, and I quote, "If the Government maintains that its political agreement persists, the requirement to make a statement could be avoided." That's why this side of the House is suspicious. Is the Government's strategy to continue to give us a meaningful vote, or is it instead to run down the clock and, in the words of the Godfather movies, in the face of no deal, to make us an offer that we can't refuse?
Well, let me just repeat to the honourable gentleman, because I think it is an important question, and I think I have provided the answer. Let me just repeat the line towards the end of my statement in answering this urgent question. Let me say this very clearly. In the unlikely and highly undesirable circumstances that, as of 21st of January, there is no deal, not a deal before the House, the government would bring a statement to the House and arrange for debate as specified by law. I think that answers his question precisely.
Mr. David Jones. Section 13, subsection 2 provides that the meaningful vote should, so far as practical, be held before the European Parliament decides whether to consent to the withdrawal agreement. Now, the withdrawal agreement has been concluded, but not approved. Can my honourable friend assure the House that the meaningful vote will take place before the European Parliament makes that decision?
Yes, I'm happy to give him that assurance.
Carol Monaghan.
Mr. Speaker, I mean, this whole situation is bonkers, and the public are frankly fed up with this carry-on. We already know the impact it's having on the academic sector. So will the Minister confirm that allowing this to drag into New Year is simply unacceptable to the electorate? And will he categorically rule out the possibility of the government waiting until March before announcing no deal?
Well, I'd say to the honourable lady, I couldn't have been much clearer in my statement earlier that we will be having a meaningful vote before the 21st of January. Now, I'm very clear. I want the Prime Minister to go and get the assurances she seeks and to come back to this House as soon as possible. I'm sure that's exactly what she intends to do.
Bob Neal. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I refer to my declaration and register of interest. This is important not only for everybody in this country, but for people in Gibraltar as well. So can my honourable friend reassure me, A, that the initial deal, as at this moment, still exists, and it is still a legal deal on the table, because that certainty is really important for them, and B, take on board from those of us who want to support the deal that the sooner it is brought back, the better for those of us who wish the Prime Minister well in what she's trying to do.
Minister! My honourable friend makes an excellent point, and he and I have both recently heard directly from the Chief Minister of Gibraltar, who's very clear in his support for this deal, because he thinks it meets Gibraltar's key interests and preserves British sovereignty. These are absolutely crucial points, which I look forward to supporting when the deal returns to the House.
Ian Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sorry to sound suspicious, but the Minister has used two words in his statement which make us all suspicious. He's used assurance and reassurance, which we've heard time and time again from this government, and then they have reneged on. So given there is a vast majority of MPs in this House who wish to prevent a no deal, and indeed the Chancellor repeated that in Treasury questions just before this, will the government either rule that out now or bring a motion to this House so we can vote on it and rule out a no-deal scenario?
I have to say to the honourable gentleman that what we are talking about is Section 15 of the Withdrawal Act. That is Section 13, which is issues this House has already debated. What I've delivered today is the government's clear interpretation of those and the fact that there will be a meaningful vote before this House.
William Ragg.
Mr. Speaker, could my honourable friend confirm that motions of this House, amended or otherwise, do not override the law?
My honourable friend, of course, is right that the law has a senior and more important effect, but what we are talking about here is the law. We are talking about the EU Withdrawal Act of 2018.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister will understand that yesterday shredded all the goodwill that was left in this House when it comes to these assurances. And I listened to the Attorney-General last Monday when he told this House that he had a solemn and constitutional duty to advise it on these legal questions objectively and impartially, and to place such legal expertise as I have at its disposal. The historical precedents strongly support that view. The House may be sure that I shall discharge this duty with uncompromising and rigorous fidelity. So the fact that he's not here today to give that legal weight to what the Minister is saying is a concern to all of us who have to go back to our constituents and explain what on earth is happening in this place. Can he therefore confirm that the Attorney-General has consulted with him on what he said today and that he will publish any legal advice he's given in the light of yesterday's rulings and what happens on Section 13?
Minister. I have to say to the honourable lady that I'm sure if she were to approach the Attorney-General, he would discharge all responsibility. But this question was about an act for which my department is responsible. Of course it is right that I should be at the dispatch box as a Minister for Department for Exiting the European Union to answer questions on our legislation.
Robert Goodwill.
The leader of the Labour Party regularly attends meetings of his European socialist colleagues, many of whom are actually in government. Is the Minister aware of anything whatsoever positive that has come out of those meetings that has facilitated the deal and helped deliver it on Brexit? Or is it the case that the Labour Party, as far as delivering a workable Brexit is concerned, is part of the problem, not part of the solution?
Order. I'm most grateful to the honourable gentleman for his inquiry, which suffers, however, from the rather notable disadvantage that there is no responsibility of the Leader of the Opposition for the formulation of policy or the continent-wide attempts made to secure an agreement, and therefore I emphasise upon advice that there is no responsibility on the Minister to attempt to answer what was no doubt a well-meaning, but in practical terms is a disorderly question. Mr Vernon Coker.
Mr Speaker, can the Minister confirm, once again for the benefit of this House and for the country who are going to read his remarks and listen to what he said, that there are absolutely no circumstances, no legal interpretation, no scenario which may or may not crop up over the next few days or few weeks which will deny this Parliament the opportunity to vote on whatever the government comes back with or not. Because I tell you this, Minister, as the Minister has heard from across the House, the trust in the government is such that he has got a lot of work to do to make people believe him.
Minister.
I'm very happy to say I think the short summary of my statement is there will be a meaningful vote. There will be a meaningful vote in all circumstances, and so I'm happy to give them that assurance.
Sir Oliver Heald.
Honourable friend referred to the withdrawal agreement bill that would follow a successful vote for the agreement. Does he agree with me that this will be a major piece of constitutional legislation covering some important issues? For example, citizens' rights, how they're embedded, where the law, what the legal base is for laws during the period of transition, what the duty on our Supreme Court is in terms of the CJEU decisions, and so on. What steps is he going to take to make sure there is an opportunity to consult widely on this and to make sure that we're not left with inadequate time to consider very important points?
Minister. My friend makes a very important point. This is a crucial piece of legislation as we move forward. And of course it's right that the House should have its meaningful vote first before the introduction of the withdrawal agreement bill. But we've been doing a huge amount of work to prepare that piece of legislation. We've published a white paper on it, and we shall continue to engage with the House and its select committees on that area.
Vera Hobhouse.
Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister has mentioned on a number of occasions recently, including her statement yesterday, it's her deal, no deal or no Brexit. How is the government actually preparing for the Prime Minister's third option? If she's taking it seriously, why would she otherwise mention it?
I think the Prime Minister has been very clear that that is a political comment about the outcomes if other people were to take control. We are very clear we will not be revoking Article 50. My Secretary of State made that very clear yesterday, and therefore it is a question of having an orderly withdrawal with an agreement or no deal. I think the orderly withdrawal with the agreement is much the preferable of those two options.
James Heapy.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. It's absolutely right that you, your clerks, the library and the government will want to agree the rules arising from the legislation thus far passed so we can have certainty over the Brexit endgame. But, Mr Speaker, that endgame is the most chaotic and uncertain scenario imaginable within the entire Brexit process. So are we not better finding common ground now so that we can support a deal and deliver Brexit for the British public?
Yes. I wholly agree with my honourable friend. I think he makes a very important point, and I think it is really important that this House now works together to ensure we can find that common ground and we can improve the withdrawal agreement when it's brought back to this House.
Angela Smith.
And if this country faces a no-deal exit from the European Union, the fault for that, the responsibility for that, will lie squarely with the government and particularly the Prime Minister. Is it not the case, having listened to the Minister this afternoon? Is it not the case, listening to the Minister this afternoon, that what we're facing now is not a meaningful vote, but rather a blackmail strategy.
Minister.
Absolutely not. What I've made clear is that under all circumstances this House will have a meaningful vote, but I think it is incumbent on MPs on all sides of this House to remember what they promised to their electorate in terms of delivering the outcome of the referendum and getting a good negotiated deal. That is something we should all be supporting when the withdrawal agreement returns to this House.
David T.C. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could my right honourable friend tell me if members opposite continue to oppose any of the very generous compromises that are being put forward, at what point will he withdraw the offer of £39 billion for the bureaucracy in Brussels and spend it preparing for the full, clean World Trade Organisation Brexit that over 17 million people have voted for?
Well,
Minister,
as always, makes his point with great force and with great power. But what I'm talking about today is the government's commitments to this House and how we will meet them, and I want to focus on that. We have put before the House a withdrawal agreement, which of course includes settling our dues with Brussels, but crucially also ending them, taking control of our money as we leave the EU.
Dame Louise Ellman.
Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Prime Minister failed to put before the House the deal that she herself described as the best possible negotiable deal. And now she's travelling the capitals of Europe pleading for help. There's a growing sense of chaos in the country and a feeling that the government is simply not in control. Doesn't the Minister agree that one of the options he should be considering is putting this issue back to the people with an option to stay in the EU, the best deal we have?
Minister.
I don't agree with the Honourable Lady because I think it is incumbent on all of us to remember that it was this House that legislated for the referendum. It was this House that promised people that their views would be listened to and followed. And it is for us, therefore, to deliver on the outcome of that referendum, as both our parties promised in their manifestos just last year.
Alex Chaw.
It's vitally important that the House has its say on this crucial issue, so I'm grateful for the Minister's assurances. But the 21st of January is nearly 6 weeks away. Does he agree with me that that should be a deadline, not a target? If this matter can come back before the House, it should do. We need to resolve this at the earliest possible opportunity.
Well, I'm happy to agree with my honourable friend wholeheartedly.
Stephen Doughty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The problem is, Mr. Speaker, is that nobody believes them anymore.
No.
And that is exactly why the Attorney-General should, as my right honourable friend said, be forced to come to this House and to put in writing the assurances the Minister has given. Because the Minister has simply been put up as chaff today for other ministers above his pay grade who, quite frankly, are willing to resort to any level of trickery and contempt for this House. And that's the reality. Can the Minister tell me, speaking of trickery, and can he be very, very clear about this, were any EU member states or any EU officials or European Commission officials informed of the plan to pull the vote before the Cabinet discussed it and before this House was told?
I have to say, chaff is a new description for me, which I'm honoured to receive from the honourable gentleman. But I have to say to him, what I've been in front of this House doing is to be very clear on the government's interpretation of Section 13 of the Withdrawal Act and to answer that we will have a meaningful vote. I'm not here to speculate on other matters.
Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The contempt with which this government holds Parliament seems to know no bounds. The answers of the Minister today suggest it's either their way or the highway, and that is not good enough. Parliament's voice must be heard on this issue. And apart from the Minister's word, what consequences, what actual consequences are there if the government doesn't bring a vote to the House of Commons by the 21st of January? There seems to be no consequences for holding Parliament into contempt. There seems to be no consequences for pulling the vote that should have been taken place today. So what will be the consequences if the government doesn't bring a vote before the 21st of January?
I have to say to the honourable lady, the government will bring a vote before 21st of January.
Mrs. Ellen Goodman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, we had a significant judgment from the European Court, which does open up another option. So when the Minister tells the Attorney-General that we want written advice, can the Attorney-General take into account yesterday's judgment in what he sends us?
I have to say to the Honourable Lady that I'm sure the Attorney-General takes into account all judgments of the Court of Justice of the European Union, but I don't believe that changes the policy of the Government, as my Secretary of State made very clear yesterday.
Okay.
Andrew Slaughter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The 21st January is a long way in the future, particularly for those businesses and for those EU citizens whose lives are on hold, who are struck with uncertainty. The Minister said he thought this could be brought back for a lot earlier than that. Could we hear a bit more of the Minister's thoughts? Why, given there's 4 sitting weeks, more than 4 sitting weeks, can we not have this vote before we break for the Christmas recess?
Well, I think the honourable gentleman will know that the date of 21st of January is, of course, set in the Act, and that's because that is what Parliament decided should be in the Act. What I would say, I've been very clear that I would like to see this being voted on before then, and I think many of us across the House would like to see that. I would also point out, though, when he talks about European citizens, I think this is very important. I think the deal that we have negotiated is the best way of securing their livelihoods and allowing them to continue as before. But of course, the Government has also made significant commitments about unilateral steps we would take, even in the absence of a deal.
Karen Park.
Events have meant extra cost and extra disruption for business and for public services.
Exactly.
Can the Minister help me to understand why it is we are expected to believe his assurance that the Government will bring forward a vote before the 21st in several weeks' time, when we were unable to believe the word that was given by Government ministers yesterday morning that there would be a vote today? And can I invite him to use a different expression? Rather than saying we will have a vote before the 21st of January, can he tell us in legal terms that this Government must have a vote before the 21st?
Yeah.
Well, I would say to the Honourable Lady that I've been very clear in my statement that the Government wants to follow both the spirit and the letter of the law. I think that is the answer to her question.
Paul Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think we all have a fairly shrewd idea that no amount of sugarcoating is going to salvage this deal. It is dead in the water and is highly likely to fail when it does meet the test of a parliamentary vote. Given that situation, what contingency is the Government planning? They have agreed that it would be disastrous for us to crash out with no deal, so they're ruling out any option, including potentially unilaterally revoking the Article 50 declaration.
Well, the Honourable Gentleman talks about contingencies, and of course a huge amount of contingency work has been done, including by my honourable friend beside me on the bench. But we are very clear that we think the best way forward is to secure a deal, to make sure that we have the best deal possible, and that is exactly what the Prime Minister is fighting for.
Mike Gapes.
Mr. Speaker, given the dysfunctional and duplicitous behaviour that we've seen in the last few days, wouldn't it be best if the Government listened to the very wise words of the former Conservative Prime Minister, Sir John Major, speaking in Dublin today, who has asked for the revocation of Article 50?
Minister.
No, I don't believe it would be best. I think we have to remember that we were all elected on manifestos that respected the referendum result, and we have to deliver on that. And I do pay heed to Sir John Major when he makes the point about how important it is that we protect the peace process and the Good Friday Agreement. That is exactly what we're seeking to do through the negotiations with the EU.
Diana Johnson.
Speaker, the Government's handling of this whole thing has been woeful. After yesterday's shambles, I met with Reckitt's Ben Kaiser this morning, who were telling me that they're having to step up the preparations for a no-deal scenario, including having received a letter from the Secretary of State for Health saying that there could be problems at the port for up to 6 months, which would be major problems in terms of pharmaceuticals and getting raw materials into the country. So isn't it time now that we actually get on and have the vote? The Prime Minister will not bring back any major change to the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration. Let's have the vote before Christmas, and then we can see in the new year what we need to do next.
Minister.
I'd say to the Honourable Lady, I regularly meet with pharmaceuticals businesses to talk to them about the Government's plans for a deal, and also no-deal contingency planning such as that she talks about. And I recognise that the industry strongly supports securing a deal that provides the implementation period, that provides a clear pathway ahead for trade. We want to see that delivered, and I think it's right that the Prime Minister to seek to put the best possible deal before this House.
Jack Dromey.
Mr. Speaker, the success of Jaguar Land Rover in my constituency has transformed the lives of thousands of workers. But they now face a bleak new year. 6 weeks more of uncertainty takes us ever closer to the cliff. We must rule out, pending Parliament deciding where eventually we go, we must rule out no deal. Will, therefore, the government allow a vote next week on no deal, no Brexit?
Minister.
I've been very clear that the government will allow a meaningful vote. It will follow the wording of a letter and the spirit of the Withdrawal Act. But I say to the honourable gentleman, the best way to ensure the certainty that businesses crave is to make sure that we support, across this House, a withdrawal agreement that secures the implementation period and secures a good trade deal for our country.
Drew Hendry.
Mr. Speaker, figures from yesterday show that his government spent £100,000 on social media promoting the Prime Minister's deal before withdrawing it from the vote. Will he do Will he do two things? First of all, will he apologise for squandering public money in that way? And will he also give a guarantee that he will waste no more public money on pointless propaganda during this needlessly extended process?
Minister.
I'd say to the honourable gentleman that the government is absolutely right in seeking to secure a deal which is in our national interest and the national interest of the whole of the United Kingdom, and we should continue to do so.
Luciana Berger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Minister acknowledge the enormous disquiet, not just on all sides of this House, but outside of this place, across our country, that the expected vote today, which was pulled, despite repeated promises, it was 100% going ahead? We've heard from Europe that there is no chance of any change to the deal. Will his government now take responsibility, stop this uncertainty, which he will have heard from countless colleagues is having such a detrimental impact on our businesses and also on our nation's mental health, and commit to bring forward the vote by Christmas so we can all start 2019 with some certainty?
Minister.
Well, I think the honourable lady has called for certainty. I think the best way for certainty is that this deal is brought back with the assurances which European capitals are already saying they can give to aid its ratification, and brought back to this House so that we can all get behind it, back it and provide that certainty.
Owen Smith.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday's fiasco has done further damage to this country's once proud reputation for stability and good governance. Could the Minister explain to the House how another 40 days of drift and dither is going to help restore that battered reputation?
Minister.
I have to say to the honourable gentleman, who once had aspirations to lead the opposition, is that he might have provided perhaps less drift and dither from the opposition front bench. But what he wouldn't have done, I think, is to actually do what the Labour manifesto promised to do, which is to deliver on the outcome of the referendum.
Thangham Debonair.
Mr. Speaker, I told my constituents in Bristol West that I would be voting against the government's deal this evening and that I'll be voting against no deal this evening. But the government has pulled those votes, and yesterday the Minister's boss said that he would not be revoking Article 50. So isn't the truth that this government is trying to hold a no-deal Brexit gun to the country's head?
Minister.
No, I respect the fact the honourable lady has always been consistent in her views on this issue. Of course, it is right to point out that those views conflict with the promises made in the last Labour manifesto. But this government is very clear. We want this House to be able to vote on a deal. We think that deal will be in the interests of our country, and we will be bringing that deal back to this House to vote on.
Debbie Abrahams.
Mr. Speaker, after yesterday's shenanigans, and let's face it, a total abuse of power by the executive, all trust in this government has broken down. So whilst I believe the Minister is being sincere, to restore trust, will he promise to have the attorney's legal advice on Section 13 of the Withdrawal Act published? And will he also call for Article 50, the clock to be stopped on that process?
Minister. I have to say to the honourable lady is that we have been very clear on what our interpretation of Section 13 of the Withdrawal Act is. This House will have a vote. We have committed to that meaningful vote in all the circumstances envisaged by Section 13 of the Withdrawal Act.
Mr. Chris Elmore.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Minister has to understand that why members on both sides of the House have little faith in what he's saying, because he keeps answering with Section 13 that there will be a vote. The reality is there was a business motion last week that was agreed and there would be a vote today, and the government has reneged on it, which is why we don't trust them. The language is extremely important that the Minister has been using in answering his questions, and he said that he hopes before the 21st of January, shortly, and the 21st of January will be the back end of when he expected to be a vote. So he clearly knows something, so set out now when he answers my question when the vote will come.
Well, Minister, I'm very honoured that the honourable gentleman believes I know something. I would encourage him to read the urgent question itself, which I've been responding to.
Clive Efford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government is relying on the House trusting it in bringing forward a meaningful vote in the future. But yesterday's escapade suggests that the government is not always dealing from the top of the pack. The leader of the House came in here yesterday and collapsed the business without making any reference to it at all. And it was moved by a minister of the government just shouting tomorrow. Now, it would help restore some of that trust, although that was a very difficult thing for the government to do, if it were to promise not to ever do that again in this process and give this House the opportunity to vote on any future changes in the business motion.
Minister. Well, I would generally say to the honourable gentleman that he's very generous in giving me such wonderful powers to make commitments on behalf of the government forevermore. But I have been clear today about the meaningful vote that this House will have. I have been clear about our interpretation of Section 13 of the Withdrawal Act, and I do think that colleagues across the House should take that very clearly as the government's intention, what we are going to do, and I would therefore gently appeal for the trust that he talks about.
Thank you. Order. 10-minute rule motion. Norman Lamb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to legalise the possession and consumption of cannabis, to provide for the regulation of the production, distribution and sale of cannabis, and for connected purposes. Over the last few weeks, 3 of my constituents have individually come to see me to discuss cannabis. All 3 suffer acute, continuing pain. One has fibromyalgia, osteoarthritis and IBS. He has been prescribed fentanyl, which we know is highly addictive and potentially fatal. He stopped taking it out of fear of the consequences, yet cannabis offers him essential pain relief. But he has no option but to buy it illegally. He knows at any time that he could face arrest and prosecution. Following the government's reforms allowing for the prescribing of cannabis-based products for medicinal use, he went to see his GP to get a prescription. He was told that they, the GPs, were all under instructions not to refer patients to the pain clinic because there is no evidence of therapeutic value. Yet something as dangerous as fentanyl remains available. Another constituent who is rapidly advancing Parkinson's disease also uses cannabis. It's the only thing that helps him. He has also been told by his GP that he can't be referred to a specialist for cannabis to be prescribed. So we leave this man, who is acutely unwell, having to break the law in order to get relief from pain. This is surely cruel and inhuman. The third man, in his 50s, finds that cannabis is the only thing that offers him respite from pain following an injury to his leg. He has a lifelong allergy to codeine. Other painkillers have caused serious problems with his kidneys, but cannabis works for him. Fearing the risks of buying from a street dealer, he bought some over the internet. He then faced a police raid. Despite my pleas to the police that giving him a criminal record would not be in the public interest, last week he was given a caution. This man has been a law-abiding citizen all his life. He has found this whole thing acutely distressing. He fears that the consequence of the caution is that he won't be able to visit his son in Australia. The treatment of this man is shameful. What is the point of doing this to him? What is the possible public interest? Across the country, people like this are left with no option but to break the law. The government's reforms raised expectations but have dashed hopes for so many people. The approach taken by the government is so restrictive that the numbers who will benefit are minuscule. If you are lucky, you might live in an area where the police force takes an enlightened approach. Chief Constable Mike Barton in Durham has effectively decriminalised cannabis for personal use, and a recent parliamentary answer I received reveals that in some areas prosecutions and cautions have plummeted. Yet surely we can't justify this postcode lottery where two people behaving in exactly the same way are treated differently depending on where they live. One will be forever tarnished with a criminal record and the other won't. It is clear that the recent reforms are not working, so the government should look in the round at the harm that prohibition of cannabis is causing across the country and try to come up with a more enlightened approach. In Canada, the Liberal government of Justin Trudeau has implemented a new legal regulated market for cannabis for recreational and medicinal use. Their approach is instructive. In June 2016, the Minister of Justice, the Minister of Public Safety and the Minister of Health jointly set out the key principles which should guide reform, including protecting young people by keeping cannabis out of the hands of children and youth, keeping profits out of the hands of criminals, preventing people from receiving criminal records for simple cannabis possession, reducing the burden on the police and the justice system, protecting public health and safety by strengthening the law with respect to serious offences such as selling cannabis to minors and driving under the influence, providing support for addiction treatment, mental health support and education programmes to inform people about the risks, access to quality-controlled cannabis for medicinal purposes. Surely these principles should guide us too. Carrying on as we are has dreadful consequences. And I want to just make 4 key points. First, nowhere across the world has prohibition worked. Cannabis is available everywhere. Second, people have no idea what they are buying. We know that leaving supply in the hands of criminals puts particularly teenagers at risk. They are the most susceptible to suffering mental health consequences, including psychosis, from regular use of potent strains available on the street. The widespread use of these dangerous strains is the result of our failure to regulate. A regulated market would allow governments to control the safety and potency of cannabis sold by legal vendors. Yet through a misplaced desire to be tough on drugs, we leave teenagers vulnerable to exploitation from sellers who have no interest at all in their welfare. Through inaction, government and parliament are culpable. If something is potentially dangerous to children and young people, control it and regulate it. Don't leave it freely available from those keen to make a fast buck. Third, we know that the illegal market for drugs generates extreme violence in many communities, particularly the most disadvantaged. If a supplier faces competition, they don't resort to the courts to protect their market, they use extreme violence. Thousands of people have lost their lives as a result of illegal trade in drugs in countries like Mexico, but on the streets of our poorest communities, violence is meted out regularly. Young, vulnerable teenagers get caught up in this violent trade and can't escape. Yet it doesn't have to be like this. Fourth, we still criminalise thousands of people every year taking up precious police time which could be used to fight serious crime. Careers are blighted for using a substance which no doubt many people on the government benches have used at some stage in their lives. Meanwhile, the most harmful drug of all is consumed in large quantities right here in this building. Alcohol leads to violence on our streets and behind closed doors in people's homes. It destroys families up and down our country, yet we tax it and the Exchequer benefits enormously from it. Isn't there a dreadful hypocrisy that we allow our drug of choice whilst criminalising people who use another, less dangerous drug, many for the relief of pain? My bill, Mr. Speaker, offers a more rational alternative to this mess, with strict regulation of the growing, sale and marketing of cannabis, with an age limit of 18 for the purchase and consumption of cannabis, with clear controls over potency of what is sold in licensed outlets. We can at last start to protect children and teenagers. We can at last treat all those people who suffer acute pain or who have conditions such as multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's and epilepsy with dignity and respect. We can end the shameful treatment of these people as criminals. We can at last end the extraordinary practice of handing billions of pounds every year to organised crime. We can instead start to tax the sale of cannabis so that revenues can be used for good purpose, public health education, the NHS, schools and the police. We can start to take some of the violence and intimidation off our streets and restore order in our poorest communities. We can free up police time to focus on serious crime. Mr. Speaker, this is rational, evidence-based policy making. It's time for this country to act on the evidence and to protect children and young people from harm.
Order. The question is that the right honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. Mr. Steve Double.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I first of all want to pay respect to the right honourable member for North Norfolk for introducing this bill. I know that he has a long record of campaigning on this issue, and whilst I strongly disagree with him, I do respect his desire that something be done to address this very important issue, because I'm sure, Mr. Speaker, we can all agree that something does need to be done about the current situation with cannabis use in its current form that is wrong and unsustainable and doing a great deal of damage to our society. But I do not believe that liberalising it in the way that has just been proposed and decriminalising it will be the answer. Part of my view is largely informed by experience that I have had personally of seeking to help and support people who have been regular users of cannabis, and I've seen very close up and first hand the lives that it wrecks, the impact on mental health that it has, and the cost that it not only has to the individuals, but to their families, to their communities, and to wider society. And I have to say to the right honourable gentleman, I was slightly confused in the line that he was taking, because he seemed to be confusing medical use for cannabis with recreational use. And I think the government should take great credit for the progress that has been made recently in allowing the use of cannabis products for medical use, and that is absolutely right, and I believe has a great deal of support across the country. And I would agree with the argument that more should be done to ensure that cannabis for medical use gets to the people who really need it. And I would agree with the point that more needs to be done to get medical professionals on board and for them to adjust to the new regime. But let's remember, these new measures were only introduced just a few weeks ago on the 1st of November, and I think we need to give more time to allow these changes to come into effect before we take a huge leap of faith towards decriminalising cannabis altogether. My concern is that by liberalising cannabis use, we will be sending precisely the wrong message to our young people. We will be giving them the message that somehow cannabis is safe and okay to use. And I believe we need to make very clear that cannabis is a dangerous drug and there is no safe use in an uncontrolled way, in an unregulated way, for cannabis to be consumed. We are clearly in the midst of a war on drugs. But I would say that we do not win the war by raising the white flag and giving up and surrendering. No war has ever been won by surrendering. It's been well established the impact of regular cannabis use on mental health. There is strong evidence that demonstrates that frequent use of cannabis is linked to the inducement of psychosis. One study in South London revealed that there was a threefold increase in the risk of individuals having a psychotic disorder amongst regular cannabis users compared to those who do not use cannabis. In recent years, we have seen a steady decline in steady reduction in the use of cannabis. Over the last 20 years, it has declined by 30%. YouGov polling conducted this year indicates that legislation could significantly disturb this overall downward trend. Over a quarter of people under 25 who have never tried cannabis before indicated that they would definitely or would be likely to try it if it was legalised. That is over 1 million 18 to 24-year-olds. Of those who have used cannabis before, well over a third of 18 to 24-year-olds said that they would be more likely to use it more regularly if it was decriminalised. I believe that legislation would send a very wrong message to our young people that cannabis is okay to use. And I think we all understand that for many people, the use of cannabis is a gateway drug to more serious and more damaging drug use. And therefore, it would be absolutely wrong to send this message that somehow cannabis is okay because of where it would lead for many, many people. Of course, as with most laws, the Misuse of Drugs Act is adhered to by the vast majority of people, but it is ignored by some. We must not forget that the current law does deter a great many from drug use, and this serves a very important public interest. But this is no endorsement of the status quo. We all have at least some common ground here. It is intolerable to see our young people hurting themselves or ending their lives prematurely because of the effects of this dangerous drug. Our approach must be bolder. We must be offering more meaningful support and aim to drive consumption down yet further. This will not be achieved by a new website or a helpline. We need to intervene and challenge, using experts in the field of drug use, recovered addicts and recovering users who can reach out and invite a real prospect of change for users. A procedure that replaces the current system of issuing a relatively ineffectual warning or punitive fine given by a police officer with an alternative of offering diversion through the attendance of a local drug awareness day would have a greater impact in reducing use. Our part of what is currently charged as a fixed penalty notice could go instead to local treatment providers to pay for the service. Yeah, very good. The Right Honourable Gentleman referred to the situation in Canada. But it's interesting that on the eve of the legislation being introduced in Canada, an article published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal referred to the legislation as a national uncontrolled experiment in which the profits of cannabis producers and tax revenues are squarely pitched against the health of Canadians. Yes, we can learn from experiments taking place elsewhere, but we don't need to risk the lives of some of our most vulnerable residents to do that. This is one of the many substances that plagues our communities and rob both young and old, and predominantly the most disadvantaged of a full life. We must commit to do more, to have a person-centric approach, to show compassion, yet keep the decisiveness of criminal law to intervene when the public interest demands it. I accept that there is a trend from other nations to legalise cannabis, but the evidence at this stage is still very mixed. Decriminalisation at best is a risky step for us to take. And whilst I understand the desire for something to be done to address this issue, I do not believe that liberalisation in this way is right for our country at this time. We need to do better for our young people, but giving up the war on cannabis is not the way to achieve that. I cannot support this bill, and if the House does divide on this issue, I will be voting against it, and I would encourage other members to join me to not allow this bill to progress.
Order. The question is that the right honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many as have that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Division! Clear the lobby. Order. The question is that the right honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many as other opinions say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. No. Tellers for the ayes, Tom Brake and Jamie Stone. Tellers for the noes, Sir Mike Penning and Andrew Selous. Lock the doors! Order! Order!
The ayes to the right, 52. The noes to the left, 66.
The ayes to the right, 52. The noes to the left, 66. So the noes have it. The noes have it. Unlock. Order. We come now to the emergency debate under Standing Order number 24. I call the Leader of the Opposition, Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move that this House has considered the Prime Minister's unprecedented decision not to proceed with the final 2 days of debate and the meaningful vote, despite the House's order of Tuesday the 4th of December and her failure to allow this House to express its view on the government's deal or her proposed negotiating objectives without the agreement of this House. Mr. Speaker, I've had the privilege of serving in this House for 35 years. And I've had strong disagreements with every Prime Minister that served during that period. And it's all there on the record. But I have never, in all those years, witnessed such an abject mess as this Prime Minister is making of these crucial Brexit negotiations and in presenting her deal to the House. Most Prime Ministers lose votes and get things wrong, but yesterday the Prime Minister demeaned her office by unilaterally taking her discredited deal off the table and running away rather than facing the verdict of this House, which we should have been voting on today. There's nothing wrong with standing by your principles, but this deal is not one of principles, and apparently not even one she's prepared to stand by anyway. Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, they didn't even have the decency to allow a vote, the government that is, to allow a vote on the withdrawing of business. She let down all MPs and the people we represent on both sides of this House, the overwhelming majority of whom know this deal is dead and want to go on with putting a realistic solution in place. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my colleagues in the Labour Party who supported this application yesterday, and colleagues in all the other opposition parties who also supported this application yesterday, and indeed members on the other side from both areas of debate within the Conservative Party to ensure that a vote could take place.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. And does he not agree with me that the frequency and ease with which this government holds this Parliament in contempt, and also the ease with which they find it to mislead the British public, is frankly appalling and pathetic?
It's true.
It is true. And now, also, we have the news from BuzzFeed, whereby it is alleged that the Prime Minister told top EU officials she intended to pull the Brexit vote 24 hours before she told senior cabinet members. Would my right honourable friend agree that that is appalling?
Order. I'm most grateful. I wanted the honourable gentleman to complete his intervention. Can I just remind the House that interventions should be brief, not mini speeches, because there's a lot to get through and 32 people wanting to contribute after the principles. Jeremy Corbyn.
I thank my friend for that intervention. Indeed, that news is very disturbing indeed. The House should be told first, not the media, not anybody else. Yes, of course.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way, and it's not just BuzzFeed that reporting to the Mirror, and I've been told this myself, that the Prime Minister actually spoke to a number of EU member states and indeed officials before she spoke to the Cabinet and before she spoke to the House to say that the vote would be cancelled. But would you agree with me, it's also shocking that I've also been told that apparently the addendum that she is now seeking was drafted weeks ago, before we even started the debate in this House.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Well, the whole process gets curiouser and curiouser, Mr. Speaker. This is no longer a functioning government, and the Prime Minister must admit her deal is dead. Her shambolic negotiations have ended in failure, and she no longer has the authority to negotiate for this country when she doesn't even have the authority of her own party.
I thank the Leader of the Opposition for giving away. Doesn't he accept that it's rather strange for the Opposition to criticise the Prime Minister for not seeking clarity on the backstop, and then when she does go to Brussels to do just that which they have called for, to criticise her for that very action?
Jeremy Corbyn!
I am full of admiration, absolutely full of admiration for the honourable member's ability to keep a straight face while she asked that question. Parliament may not have had the chance to vote down her deal, Mr. Speaker, as she herself has admitted. If she had put it before this House, I think we all know it would have been defeated by a very significant margin indeed. She has no authority.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. Would he also agree with me that it isn't just that she let this House down and our constituents down, but taxpayers have been paying the price, with reports that £100,000 was spent on Facebook advertisements supporting her deal in the last week. Her ministers were sent round the country, and all of us who have spent time and resources consulting with our constituents have absolutely been let down with not being able to express our view and their view in a vote in this House.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Well, I thank my friend for that intervention. The Prime Minister has indeed wasted £100,000 of public money in just 7 days on Facebook adverts, trying and indeed failing to sell this dog's dinner of a Brexit deal. There were days when both the Prime Minister and I served as local councillors. Had we spent public money in that way, we would have been surcharged for a waste of public money without proper approval.
Grateful to the honourable gentleman. He is of course right. This government are in absolute shambles. They have failed the country. They are in contempt of Parliament. Will he not do the right thing now and table a motion of no confidence in this government so we can be shut of them?
Jeremy Corbyn. Mr. Speaker, I've tabled this motion today, which the member supported the tabling of. We have no confidence in this government. We need to do the appropriate thing at the appropriate time to have a motion of no confidence in order to get rid of this government. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister not only failed to convince the public, she now seems unable to convince the European Union to accept any meaningful changes in her proposals. Yes, of course.
Grateful to the Leader of the Opposition for giving way, but if he's followed the debate, he'll notice that he had complaints about the backstop. So did most of the 164 speakers that we've had. And so isn't it right for the Prime Minister to go and see if she can mend it? And if he disagrees with that, why?
Well, I thought that was a really valiant attempt to defend the indefensible. I mean, it is utterly ludicrous. Everyone knew the date this vote was going to be put. The whole world knew about it. And we now hear that apparently the Prime Minister was trying to arrange some backroom deal ahead of it and then pulled the vote, but didn't bother to tell an awful lot of other people she was doing so. I do admire his attempts at defending what is completely indefensible.
Last week, the government were found to be in contempt of Parliament. Would my honourable friend agree with me that if indeed the media were briefed before this House, that is further contempt for this Parliament?
Jeremy Corbyn. Well, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister cancelled the Cabinet meeting this morning. Presumably she's worried about I've got a majority there or not. But apparently many of her ministers are very upset, and I can't say as I blame them. At least a dozen were sent into TV and radio stations yesterday morning to deny the Prime Minister would pull the vote before somebody helpfully phoned from Downing Street to pull them out of the studio to say the line had changed. This is an extraordinary way of not running a government. The Northern Ireland Secretary was quoted saying the UK must move on with Brexit or risk being riven with division, shortly before the Prime Minister decided not to move on with Brexit. This is the same Prime Minister who said hers was the best deal and indeed the only deal. So if that's the case, what is she doing today in Europe? Mr. Speaker, this runaway Prime Minister is not even seeking to negotiate. She confirmed she's only seeking reassurances. Mr. Speaker, our Prime Minister is traipsing around the continent in pursuit and search of warm words when she can get out of the car to hear them. It really is, Mr. Speaker, if I may say so, the unspeakable in pursuit of the unwritten. A waste of time and a waste of public money. Because of her own unworkable red lines, the European Commission says it will not renegotiate with her. And the Prime Minister concedes she is not negotiating either. So what on earth is she doing, travelling from capital to capital in Europe? It can't be Christmas shopping, I'm sure that's not the case. So what on earth is she doing in Europe? But worse than that, Mr. Speaker, it shows that once again she is simply not listening.
I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Member for giving way. In ensuring the integrity of our union, does he agree that the only way you can deal with the backstop is to amend the legally binding text of an international agreement?
Jeremy Corbyn. The red lines that the Prime Minister set out with this backstop became impossible, and because of her bungled negotiations, there is a greater chance of entering into an indefinite backstop. That is why one of the reasons we would be voting against this, as indeed I believe the honourable member would also.
I thank my right honourable
friend for giving way. I know that there are legitimate concerns about the Northern Ireland backstop, but will you agree with me? It's not only the backstop that's a problem with this deal. Can you remember a time in British history when the Prime Minister of this country and the Chancellor have recommended a course of action, their deal, which will make people worse off according to their own analysis?
Jeremy Corbyn. I can't recall a time when any government has come to the House to promise something that will make people worse off and then blindly continue to go ahead with it. It's not only the backstop that's a problem, Mr. Speaker. Many will not vote for the blindfold Brexit on the basis of a 26-page wish list that's attached to it. It fails to guarantee frictionless trade that the Prime Minister promised. It fails to maintain membership of vital agencies and programmes. It fails to ensure rights and protections will be kept in place, and fails to provide a comprehensive customs union with a UK say. And on the latter point, Mr. Speaker, I welcome the former Brexit Minister Lord Bridges for his endorsement of a permanent customs union, saying it could be the basis for a parliamentary consensus. Yesterday, following her statement, the Prime Minister failed to answer a single one of my questions. So last night, I wrote to her, together with the leaders of the SNP, Plaid Cymru, the Liberal Democrats and the Greens. We set out 5 questions to the Prime Minister. Sadly, she's not here to answer them. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, when she returns from this strange stage-managed foray to Europe, I hope the Prime Minister will reply promptly to the 5 opposition parties who wrote to her. Because whilst she sends our country into a Brexit-induced paralysis, the coming winter threatens the deepest crisis in our NHS. Homelessness and rough sleeping continue their unrelenting rise. The local government funding settlement is delayed yet again, meaning our very hard-hit councils can't start budgeting for next year, and neither can the police, facing rising violent crime because their funding settlement is delayed too. Another government contractor, we learn, is at risk, and thousands of jobs too, as Interserve teeters on the brink of collapse. And all the while, the economy is slowing, high streets in crisis, shares tumbling and the pound plummeting. This isn't strong and stable government, it's weak leadership from a weak Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Some people say talk of poverty and food banks is a distraction from Brexit. Given the impact on food prices, doesn't he think that actually it's the central issue?
Jeremy Corbyn. Poverty is the central issue in this country. As the UN report pointed out, 14 million of our fellow citizens are living in poverty. More will be rough sleepers than for many, many years over this Christmas, and we have hundreds of thousands of children living in insecure temporary accommodation, many of them very hungry over this Christmas. That is not a good look, and we should be having a government that's concentrated on reducing the levels of poverty in this country.
Would he agree with me that the 100,000 given to Facebook spent on Brexit advertising by the government could have been given to all of our constituencies to alleviate food poverty?
Corbyn. Indeed, £100,000 would help a lot of food banks get more food in order that the hungry can get something to eat. Mr. Speaker, if the Prime Minister comes back with nothing more than warm words, then she must immediately put her deal to the House. No more delays, no more tricks. Let Parliament take control. If not, then, frankly, Mr. Speaker, she must go. We cannot tolerate delay any longer. With a legally enshrined exit date of the 29th of March 2019, just over 100 days away, we cannot allow this shambles to endure, and neither can we risk falling into a no deal.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. In addition to the force that was facing the country yesterday, one of the biggest consequences will be the impact it has on the 22,000 EU nationals living in my constituency. The settled scheme status is still being developed. The Home Office app for registration has been branded and absolute useless by academics. Does my honourable friend agree with me that the limbo facing this House will have great, distressing consequences for our EU nationals in our constituencies?
I thank my friend for the intervention and compliment her on the work she does on behalf of her constituents. All of us represent EU nationals, some in greater numbers than others. We all know the horror and the stress that they've been through over the past 2.5 years. The stress where one partner comes from one part of Europe, the other from Britain, and the stress on those children is huge, which is why, straight after the referendum, on our behalf, Andy Burnham moved from this dispatch box a motion guaranteeing permanent rights of residence for all EU nationals. That was agreed on a non-binding motion. 2.5 years later, we still have not had that absolute legal certainty from this government of protection of those EU nationals. They deserve it, and we also need to recognise that they've made a massive contribution to our economy, to our way of life, to our health service and to all of our public services. We should thank them for it and assure them they have a permanent place in this country, whatever the outcome of these particular rounds of talks. Mr. Speaker, we will work across this House to prevent any further damage to our economy, to our international standing and to our democracy. So I say to the limited number of government backbenchers opposite, let Parliament have a say on this shabby deal. Let Parliament take back control of it, because this government has lost the ability to lead, the ability to negotiate and the ability to speak for this House in those negotiations.
Question is, as on the order paper, I call the Minister for the Cabinet Office and the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Mr. David Liddington.
Mr. Speaker, sir, the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Leader of the Opposition, spent most of his time in his speech attacking my Right Honourable friend, the Prime Minister, and I think it's perhaps worth reminding him and the House that in the last 2 months alone, my Right Honourable friend has spent more than 22 hours at this dispatch box making statements and answering questions from Right Honourable and Honourable members in every corner of this House, predominantly about the question of EU exit and the deal which she negotiated. She has made, in that time alone, 6 full oral statements dedicated to that subject and opened the debate in this House on the 4th of December.
Order. There will be plenty of opportunity for other honourable and right honourable members to speak in the debate and indeed to seek to intervene, but the Minister for the Cabinet Office must be heard. Mr. David Liddington.
Mr. Speaker, I think anybody who has observed my Right Honourable friend, the Prime Minister, in action both in her current office and the other offices she has held over the years, will be in no doubt about her commitment to parliamentary accountability, whatever the cost to her in terms of the time that you, sir, rightly should say that she should be spending, and she accepts she should spend, in asking questions from colleagues in every party, in every corner of this House. Give way to my Right Honourable friend from Putney.
I'm very grateful to him for giving way, and I think nobody doubts how much effort the Prime Minister has put into this entire process of Brexit. But in the end, what matters to people outside of here isn't effort, it's results. And this House ought to have the chance to vote on those results.
Shall say shortly, Mr. Speaker, this House will indeed have that opportunity. I will give way to the Right Honourable Gentleman.
Grateful to the Minister for giving way. After all that debate, what the businesses, the farmers, the consumers, all the people in my constituency want to know is when is this matter going to be resolved, and that we will resolve tonight had we had that vote. What date will we have this vote?
What the businesses and the farmers whom I have talked to in Wales and in my constituency and many other parts of the country have said is that they want honourable members from every political party to get behind the deal, get it in place as rapidly as possible, so that they can have the certainty and the clarity of the transitional period and the ability to plan investment decisions, job creation decisions that currently are being held while that uncertainty prevails. Give way to the honourable lady from the Liberal Democrats.
Very grateful giving way. Does he not also accept that whilst the Prime Minister may have had plenty of time to speak about this, we have not? We did have 15 hours of debate in which we could have presented the case for our constituents. For me, the university sector, the automobile sector, the science sector, 2 ministers have gone who used to cover those portfolios because they can now see the effect it's going to have. Does he not understand the intense frustration on this side with this government that won't let us speak up for our constituents?
Correct. Mr. Speaker, for the reasons that I've already set out, there have been many hours already, including the 3 days so far of the debate on the meaningful vote, in which members of Parliament from all parts of the House have been able to express those views. I'll give way to the member from the SNP, and then I'm going to make progress.
To the Right Honourable Gentleman. It's always good to see him at the dispatch box, but perhaps he could explain exactly what the Prime Minister is doing. She's heard what the EU leaders have told us. They're not prepared to negotiate this deal. Shouldn't this Prime Minister, the worst dancing queen in history, come back here and face her Waterloo?
The honourable gentleman's been crafting that one for quite a time, I can see. I mean, the reality is, he asked what my right honourable friend is doing. The answer is that my right honourable friend is responding to the points made to her again and again by members of this House, because in the statements and in the exchanges which followed, and in the debates, Mr. Speaker, that we have had so far, honourable members have expressed criticisms, usually focused, not exclusively, but for the most part, on one issue, the so-called backstop on the Irish border. And again, right honourable and honourable members in all parts of the House have asked her to go back to EU member states and the Commission to seek changes, and in particular to provide assurances that the backstop would only be temporary. That is exactly what my right honourable friend has done. Give way to my honourable friend.
To my right honourable friend for giving way. It was very clear from the first 3 days of debate, and colleagues have not been backwards in making themselves available to the media to also say how much they disagree with the deal, that the House was not going to pass it. So surely the Prime Minister has done exactly the right thing in going back off to Europe to try and get a better deal to put to the House in due course.
My honourable friend puts it well, and as I said, the Prime Minister is responding to the wish expressed by many, many members of the House. Can I give way to the right honourable lady?
Thank the right honourable gentleman for giving way. We both came into the House at the same time, and I doubt that either of us have been in a situation quite as dangerous and fraught as this. Surely he will agree with me that after yesterday, the Prime Minister has shredded her credibility, and many, many people on both sides of the House now find it almost impossible to believe a word that she says, because she asserts one thing one day and then the opposite the day after. She sends her cabinet out to assert the vote is going on, even as she's planning to pull it. Surely he must understand that we cannot go on with this Prime Minister at the helm.
No, I reject that completely, and I think if one looks at what happened in the last week, my right honourable friend returned from the G20 meeting in Argentina the previous Sunday. She gave a statement to this House on the Monday, and then she both led the debate on the European Union and the meaningful vote, listened to the many interventions that were made then, and as well as paying attention to what has been said in the House in those subsequent days, she has talked to a number of members of Parliament from different political parties here, and came to the decision over the weekend that she announced to the House yesterday. Give way to the member for Bury South.
Right honourable gentleman for giving way. Is the problem not now that ministers do not know themselves whether they're telling the truth to this House of Commons, because they are not being told the truth by the Prime Minister? This is now a question of trust, and that is the reason that the DUP are not supporting the government. It's not just a question of policy detail, it's a question of breaking trust. Ministers don't even know when they're telling the truth or not to this House anymore.
My right honourable friend convened the Cabinet by telephone conference yesterday morning to tell all members of the Cabinet about the decision that she had come to, and the Cabinet agreed to support and endorse the decision that my right honourable friend had taken. Now, Mr. Speaker, it has been very clear. It has been. Sorry, I'll give way to the gentleman from the DUP.
I'm very grateful to the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster for giving way. He said that members of this House had asked for assurances on the backstop. Will he accept, even in the late stage, that assurances won't suffice unless there's a fundamental alteration to the text of the withdrawal agreement and, indeed, an alteration to the advice given by the Attorney-General himself? It simply won't suffice.
And I'm no doubt about the view that's been expressed by the Right Honourable Member for Belfast East and by his colleagues on the DUP bench. He will understand that I'm not this afternoon going to prejudge what the outcome of the conversations the Prime Minister is having with other European leaders will be. But I know she made it clear yesterday that nothing is ruled out in those conversations. Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Deputy Prime Minister not agree that if we'd had the vote today, he wouldn't have known the views of a few members, they'd have known the views of the House? And wouldn't that have strengthened the Prime Minister's negotiating position by going back to say the House has rejected what was proposed?
The Prime Minister was in no doubt, as she said yesterday, from listening to the debate, reading Hansard and her direct conversations with members of Parliament across the House as to what the outcome was going to be. I'll give way to the Honourable Member Johnson.
It seems to me that we can have two options. Either a parliament like the European Parliament, where everything is agreed in advance and what you say in the chamber doesn't affect anybody's opinion or change anything, or you can have a parliament like this parliament, where debate is dynamic and ministers listen to what is said. Doesn't my friend agree that this is a better place to be?
I mean, the right honourable lady member for Wallasey that have reminded us that she and I have been here for a few years now, and I have sat through exchange after exchange in this chamber when members of Parliament, and from time to time it's been one or other party that's been in opposition and the other in government, time and time again, where the demand has been that ministers should respond to the debate in the House and the calls made upon them. Yet when my right honourable friend does that, the clamour of criticism increases further. I'm going, Mr. Speaker, no. Mr. Speaker, as you reminded us,
there's an enormous amount of noisy burbling from honourable and right honourable members at the Minister at the dispatch box. And in my experience, I've known the Minister for 21 years in the House and for a decade or so before then. He is an unfailingly courteous Minister and he must be heard. Minister Lidington.
I have given way a fair number of times. I am conscious that there are many honourable friends and honourable members opposite who are seeking to intervene, and I will try, Mr. Speaker, to give way further, but I'm conscious that you also told us that more than 30 members of Parliament are wanting to take part in this debate, and I'm therefore going to make some progress now, and then I will look for an opportunity to give way again later on in my speech. So, Mr. Speaker, the point that has been made by the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Leader of the Opposition, and by many other members on all sides of the House, is that there is a wish in the House to bring this matter to a head and to have a definitive vote. Yes. And of course it is a requirement under the EU Withdrawal Act for a meaningful vote to take place before the government is able to ratify any deal with the European Union, a deal in the form of a withdrawal agreement under Article 50 of the treaty. And I want to reiterate what I think has already been said very clearly by my honourable friend, the member for Worcester, earlier in this afternoon's proceedings, that the remaining stages of this debate and the votes have not been cancelled but have been deferred. The business of the House motion, which governs the debate, including the amendment successfully moved by my right honourable friend, the member for Beaconsfield, also remain in force. And the only way in which the terms of that business of the House motion could be changed were if the House itself either were to amend that motion or to pass a new motion to supersede the one currently in place. And as I will give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm a bit rusty on my procedure, but am I right that the way that the motion is drafted, it can only be amended by a Minister of the Crown? And if the government wanted to put back the vote because the Prime Minister wanted more time to go to Europe, I mean, she's only admittedly had 2 years, but if she needed more time, then the honourable thing that the government should have done yesterday was come to the House, table a revised business motion to say put the vote back 1 week, argued to the House why they needed that extra time, and then put it to the vote. That would have been the honourable way to proceed. Why did the government not do that?
Mr. Speaker, while it might be for the government to bring forward any amendment to the business of the House motion, of course such an amendment would only carry if the House as a whole votes to approve it. So, and as happened, Mr. Speaker, my right honourable member will forgive me. I'm going to try to answer his question.
Well, we can't vote if you don't bring it forward,
Mr. Speaker, I'm trying to answer my right honourable friend's question. And just as the business of the House motion that currently governs the debate is one that was open for debate and was then approved by this House in order to take effect, those provisions would apply as well to any subsequent change to the terms of that motion. So it would be a matter for the House as a whole. And I would say in response to the second point made by my right honourable friend, the member for Rayleigh, that we do not know for certain at this stage what the outcome of the talks that my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, is having today with other European leaders will be, or what the discussions and conclusions may be of the European Council that is scheduled to take place later this week. And the judgment that we have made as a government is that in those circumstances, the right thing will be to come forward with the House as soon as we have that certainty. And I do want to make it clear that the Prime Minister said yesterday, and my honourable friend, the member for Worcester, said earlier, the government will at the very latest bring this debate and vote back before the 21st of January. And if I can echo a point that was made, Mr. Speaker, in the exchanges that took place following the response to an urgent question by my honourable friend, the member for Worcester, we certainly see that 21st of January date as a deadline and not as a target. I will give way to the gentleman who's trying to get in for a long time.
I thank the Chancellor of Lancaster for giving way, and you know, he knows I have a lot of respect for him. He's got a tough gig today. Can I just ask him, the reason for this postponement and this delay is, of course, so that the Prime Minister can go away and negotiate some sort of magic piece of paper. Can he tell me, has any member of the Cabinet seen or discussed a draft of the addendum or codicil that the Prime Minister is seeking at any point over the last few weeks before the Prime Minister decided to postpone the debate? Has any member of the Cabinet seen it or discussed it?
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful for the honourable gentleman's kind words, but I mean, he will understand that I'm certainly not going to talk about the discussions that take place within cabinet meetings. Give way to the member for Rhondda.
I'm slightly confused by what the leader, he's not the leader of the House anymore, the Deputy Prime Minister is saying, because he seems to be suggesting that we will be restarting the old debate. Presumably that means that none of the people who've already spoken will speak again. Presumably it means that all the elements of the business of the House motion that we've already carried will continue. But surely to God we must do that before Christmas. We can't let this roll on and on and on whilst businesses are wasting time and money and energy making plans for something that may not come to pass.
Mr. Speaker, I will go this far with the honourable member for Rhondda that my view is, and the government's view is, that we need to push on with this sooner rather than later, but that we need to know the outcome of the discussions that my right honourable friend the Prime Minister is having before we can determine the exact timing of those future days of debate. And I would also reiterate, Mr. Speaker, that as both the Prime Minister and my honourable friend the member for Worcester have said to this House, the government regards the obligation in the event of no deal being agreed to make a statement in line with Section 13 of the EU Withdrawal Act as a solemn commitment that still stands. I will give way to the honourable lady.
To the right honourable gentleman for giving way. Does he agree that greater than the political crisis that has been created is the economic crisis, and the fact that 2% has already been knocked off the value of the pound in the last 24 hours? Isn't that a reason to press ahead with the vote?
I'm certainly second to no one in wanting this issue resolved as rapidly as possible. Give way to the honourable lady Wolverhampton.
Minister, forgive me, why won't the government rule out no deal, given the catastrophic impact that would have on businesses, jobs and people's livelihoods? And if he won't rule it out, will he tell us the delay that has been caused by this government, how much more in taxpayers' money is now going into planning for no deal because of the lack of a vote today?
It cannot be ruled out because for no deal to be removed from the table requires a ratification of a deal of some kind in Westminster, and it requires ratification by the European Parliament as well. And therefore, it would, just as any business would expect to maintain contingency plans for all eventualities, even unwelcome and unlikely ones, so the government has a responsibility to maintain its contingency planning against that eventuality. Give way to the member for Oldham.
For giving way. I mean, the truth is, this is not an isolated incident. This is a pattern of behaviour where Parliament has been frustrated and blocked at every turn. Whether it's the role that Parliament will take in this debate and deliberations, whether it's the legal advice that we consider in making that decision, or whether it's having a vote at all, at every step it's been frustrated. If this is going to be a continuation of the debate that's already been had, it will mean that whatever comes forward in whatever change or format, I won't be able to debate on behalf of my constituents because I've already taken part in the debate last week. How can that be right and fair?
As I said, first of all, I think that the government and the Prime Minister personally have been extremely committed and could demonstrate that in terms of the number of hours that have been spent in Parliament discussing these issues and responding to questions on it. I'll give way to Honourable Friend.
I thank the right for giving way. We've had a lot from the opposition about the value of the pound, suddenly becoming quite interested in economics all of a sudden. Does my honourable friend, though, quite recognise actually one of the reasons why the value of the pound has been falling? Because there is the sniff of a Labour government, which will see capital flight out of this country as we have never seen before. And even just the sniff of it is just a foretaste of what would happen if the Leader of the Opposition ever got his hands on number 10.
I mean, my right honourable friend is right, and that is not only it's not only a fear that he has expressed. That is a fear and an opinion strongly voiced by businesses large and small in every part of the United Kingdom, and the thought of a Labour government coming to power which saw the economic policies of Cuba and Venezuela as models to follow is something which should scare anybody who is interested in jobs and investment in this country. I give way to the right honourable gentleman.
For giving way. He's been asked the question twice but hasn't answered it. I'll give him one third chance. Is the government's proposition that when we do come back to this, the previous debate will continue? In other words, there'll be 2 more days and then we'll have a vote? Or is there going to be a fresh debate? Which of it is it going to be?
It's a fair question, and while I'm not going to be able to give him an absolutely clear answer, and I want quite genuinely to be as helpful as I can be on this point. The default position is that the current arrangements, including the business of the House motion, remain in place. Now, one of the things that the government will have to determine, depending on what the outcome of the European Council and the discussions the Prime Minister is having are whether, in terms of the statutory requirements on government to hold a meaningful vote under the EU Withdrawal Act, whether any changes that might have been made were of a character that would require the debate to be restarted from scratch rather than continued. So, and until we know the outcome of those talks, it is impossible for me to give greater clarity than that. But I hope the honourable gentleman will accept from me that is the best I think I can do, trying to be straight with him on the answer to his question on this. Give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way, and he's been extremely generous with his time. Can he confirm that because this vote has now been deferred, the immigration white paper, which we have been promised since the summer, will be in front of MPs before we vote on this matter?
It will depend, obviously, to a considerable extent on when the debate vote come back here on Europe. But I've spoken to my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, again about this today, and he says that he expects to be in a position to publish that white paper very soon. I'll give way to the honourable lady, and I will make some progress.
Giving way, he's been very generous with the interventions. A moment ago, he said the only way to take the risk of no deal off the table was to ratify the deal. Now, I know the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster is a very honest man. Surely he must acknowledge that there is a third way as a result of the Court of Justice's decision yesterday, and that would be to revoke the Article 50 notice. He may not wish to do that, but surely he would acknowledge that theoretically that is a third way to avoid the possibility of no deal.
The honourable lady is right. That is clearly in the wake of the Court's decision. That is a legal and constitutional possibility. But I think the Prime Minister made very clear again yesterday that that is not the government's policy, and indeed not just my party but the Labour Party did commit themselves last year to respect the result of the 2016 referendum. Give way to my honourable friend.
Very grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. Whilst this debate is interesting, it is ultimately futile in terms of having an impact on public policy. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that if, as the Leader of the Opposition has suggested, things really are so bad and as rotten as they believe them to be, does he find it surprising that we are not actually here today debating a vote of confidence in Her Majesty's government rather than faffing around with standing order debates?
Mr. Speaker, that is a very reasonable question. It's not something that is really for me to give an answer to. As I understand it, the right honourable gentleman, the Leader of the Opposition, has the right to respond briefly at the conclusion of this debate. It may well be he seizes the opportunity to give my honourable friend, the member from North Dorset, the answer that he is seeking. Now, Mr. Speaker, when the debate and the vote come back to this House, the whole House is going to have to face up to some choices, because the decision in 2016 that this country should leave the European Union has consequences. And the idea that still persists in some circles, that you can have all of the benefits of EU membership without accepting the obligations that go with that, is a fantasy. And honourable members of all parts of the House need to face up to that. It's a truth that is known, I would suggest, to any honourable member on the opposition benches who has either negotiated within the European Union while serving as a government minister, or who has worked for one of the European institutions. And when the right honourable gentleman, the Leader of the Opposition, comes to respond to this debate, I hope that he will use that opportunity to explain in greater detail something about his own position on these matters. Because at the moment, the right honourable gentleman asserts that he wishes for a comprehensive and permanent customs union between this country and the United Kingdom, with a British say in future trade deals. A wish, however desirable, that cuts across central elements of the European treaties, most notably the Common Commercial Policy. The right honourable gentleman asserts that we should use the transitional period to renegotiate the deal, dismissing the reality that the transitional period does not exist unless and until the deal has been ratified. The right honourable gentleman says that he would solve the issue of the backstop with a customs union for the whole of the United Kingdom, disregarding the fact that that does not solve the issue of the backstop, because the question of the need for common regulatory standards would still remain. And the right honourable gentleman argues that we should have a comprehensive free trade agreement to the European Union without any commitment to EU state aid rules, something which Member States and the Commission could not have been clearer about, runs again contrary to the most fundamental principles of the European treaties and of the practice and policy of successive councils and commissions over the years. Give way to my right honourable friend.
Giving way, and he makes a really powerful point. And Mr. Speaker, I think it needs to be recorded that if there's any member of this House that deserves the highest recognition, it has to be my right honourable friend, because he has consistently come at the dispatch box and made his case so eloquently and with such power. I gently say to him, however, he's right. We do need to be honest about the choices our country has faced. The problem is we're only having that debate now at the end of the process instead of at the beginning. And I gently remind him of the words of my right honourable friend, the member for Holton Price and Howden, who at that dispatch box said 2 years ago, when he was the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, he was confident he would negotiate a deal that would convey the exact same benefits as we currently enjoy as a member of the single market and the custom union. This is the problem. Too many broken promises. Too many promises that cannot be delivered.
Mr. Speaker, that is why when the House comes to debate again and vote on these matters, the House needs to do so aware that if it votes to reject the deal that the Prime Minister has negotiated, then every member, whichever side of the House they sit on, whichever party or part of the country they represent, will also need to judge what alternative they choose that will be both negotiable with the European Union and will command a majority here. And I have to say that there are some home truths that need to be faced by colleagues of mine, by honourable members opposite, who have expressed strong views on European matters. Now, some have urged that we should simply press ahead, leave without any deal and move straight away to World Trade Organisation terms. And those honourable members who are attracted by that option, perhaps on grounds of sovereignty, need to weigh the political attractiveness for them of that option against the fact that trade on WTO terms would do serious harm to our automotive, aerospace and agricultural sectors, amongst others, and that worse, a sudden severing of preferential trade access in less than 4 months' time would be hugely disruptive and harmful to our economy, with a direct cost in terms of jobs and investment. Now, those who advocate, by contrast, a different model for our future relations, whether Norway and the customs union or whether a Canadian-style classic free trade agreement with the European Union, have to address the reality that the withdrawal agreement something covering citizens' rights, something covering a financial settlement, something covering the question of the Irish border, is an unavoidable gateway to negotiations for any of those outcomes. And because there will be a risk, whether that risk is large or small, of a gap between the end of a transitional period and the new partnership coming into effect, a backstop and insurance policy of some kind for the Irish border will be an unavoidable part of such a withdrawal agreement. And then there are those, Mr. Speaker, who urge a second referendum in the hope of reversing the decision of 2016. Now, I've come to terms, Mr. Speaker, with the decision that the people took, though at the time, I think the whole House knows it was something that I hugely regretted. But I think those who champion the second referendum do have to confront the fact that such an outcome would certainly be divisive, but could not guarantee to be decisive in ending this debate. Further still, those colleagues who champion that approach should not underestimate the damage that would be done to what is already a very fragile public confidence in our democratic institutions. Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, is determined to do everything in her power now to secure the safeguards and assurances for which so many right honourable and honourable members have called. And as in every step in these negotiations, she is motivated by the national interest and by nothing else. And when we know the outcome of the talks now underway, the Government will bring the debate and the decision back to Parliament. At that point, Mr. Speaker, not only the Government, but the House, every member here, will have to confront the hard but inescapable choices which now face our country today.
Mr. Eaton Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the Minister for the Cabinet Office, and let me say to him, 35 minutes, it was a valiant attempt to defend the indefensible. Mr. Speaker, I congratulate the Honourable Member for Islington North for securing this necessary debate. Mr. Speaker, what we witnessed yesterday by the Prime Minister was an act of pathetic cowardice. A Prime Minister more focused on saving her own job and her own party than doing what is right for Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom. A Prime Minister intent on railroading a deal that will make people poorer. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister promised she would take back control. This is a government that is out of control, out of its depth, and increasingly running out of time. Back in 2014, Scotland was promised the strength and security of the United Kingdom, but instead we've been treated with contempt, left with a Westminster government in chaos and crisis. The Prime Minister promised an equal partnership, but instead she has silenced and sidelined the will of the Scottish people, the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament. Last week, this government was found to be in contempt of Parliament. Yesterday, the Prime Minister proved her government has no respect for members of this place and continued to show Parliament utter contempt as she pulled the meaningful vote from beneath her feet. And why, Mr. Speaker? This Prime Minister has denied this Parliament the right to debate and vote on her deal because she knows what we knew weeks ago. Her deal is dead in the water. It is a non-starter. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has lost the confidence of her own benches. Today, we should have voted on the Government's motion, voting down the Prime Minister's deal and signalling that this House has no appetite for it. That would have allowed Parliament to move on and to bring forward alternatives, to make the point that there are alternatives to the Prime Minister's plans, to make the point that we could stay in the European Union, particularly given that in all the scenarios shown by the UK Government's own analysis, we will always be worse off with Brexit. Instead, we have a Prime Minister that has shown contempt of Parliament. Our rights to vote down her plans removed at the whim of the Prime Minister. Where is the parliamentary democracy we hear about? The decision that Parliament voted for to have a meaningful vote withdrawn at the say-so of the Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we do not live in a dictatorship.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the right honourable member for giving way. His constituents, like mine, Mr. Speaker, view these proceedings with amazed misunderstanding and shock. Surely, would the right honourable member agree with me that the failure to have the vote today and the continuing delay in getting a vote is dangerous for this institution and its standing, and let me go slightly further, and is dangerous for the proper working of democracy in the UK?
Thank my honourable friend for that intervention. He's absolutely right, and I know that throughout the Highlands and Islands that many businesses are saying that they are particularly worried about the ability to attract labour, that we benefit in particular from free movement of people, and the economic prosperity of the Highlands of Scotland has been endangered by the actions of this government, the willful actions of this government.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. Would he agree with me as well that yesterday's decision by the Prime Minister didn't just impact this House but impacted the markets and our economy, with investors talking about how we'd experienced the pound had experienced the worst day since the 2016 referendum, and the government had left investors completely in the dark about what had happened next. Indeed, others went on to say that the delay was kicking the can further down the road, and we would not be surprised if Brexit uncertainty, which we estimate has knocked 0.5 percentage points off growth since the referendum, starts to weigh more heavily on the economy. This we can take directly to the Prime Minister's door.
I have to say to the honourable member that we should reflect very carefully on what has happened over the last 2.5 years, because it was the case right after the Brexit referendum that the pound fell, and it's been under pressure ever since. And we know that the UK has fallen to the bottom of the G7 growth league over the course of the last couple of years. We know that inflation has been higher. We know that there has been an impact on people's pockets. Households on average have already been £600 lower as a consequence. And we have a responsibility, each and every one of us, to take the right actions that will deliver sustainable economic growth. And when the government knows that from each piece of analysis which has been conducted by it, that in all scenarios that people are going to be poorer under Brexit, the government has a responsibility to be honest with people about the risks of that. I will give way one more time, then I'll make progress.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way and commend him on a very powerful speech. I wonder if he would agree with me that the most disgraceful and despicable thing about what the Prime Minister has done by interrupting our consideration of her own plans is that yet again she is not taking the opportunity to reach out across the House, to listen to people, to revise those plans, but she is engaged in a sordid exercise to placate the ultra-right wing of her own party.
My honourable friend is spot on, and I would say to the Prime Minister she's missed opportunity after opportunity to take on the extreme Brexiteers in her own party. And if we go back to the time when the Prime Minister called the general election and she came back with a minority administration, she had a responsibility to seek to work across the House. And she had a responsibility to work with the devolved institutions. At no point has the Prime Minister sought to do so. So the reason that we're in this situation, where the government is facing such a heavy defeat, where it's placated nobody, has been because of that lack of leadership of the Prime Minister, and the responsibility lacks at her door. I want to make progress because I'm aware that many people want to speak. The Prime Minister should not have the ability, in the middle of a 5-day debate, to simply halt proceedings. Our constituents and the rest of the world must look on aghast at what took place here yesterday. We now know that we may not get to vote on these substantive matters until the 21st of January, the last conceivable date for such a vote. The Prime Minister is trying to make this a binary choice on her deal or no deal. That is unacceptable, and this House cannot let that happen. The Prime Minister cannot succeed. The Prime Minister has committed a complete dereliction of duty. Running scared from the truth, this government has backed itself into a corner and is refusing to take a road out. The SNP has been firm that our position is that we wish to remain in the European Union. We want to continue to enjoy the socio-economic benefits of working in partnership with nations right across the continent. Whilst we respect that England and Wales voted to leave the European Union, we ask that the government respect.
Good morning. The Judiciary Committee will come to order, and without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. We welcome everyone to this morning's hearing on transparency and accountability, examining Google and its data collection, use, and filtering practices. Before I recognize myself and the ranking member for opening statements, I'd like to recognize our first witness, the Majority Leader, Kevin McCarthy of California, for his statement. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Mr. Goodlatte, Chairman Goodlatte, for working with me to organize this hearing. I want to thank Sundar Pichai for testifying on Capitol Hill. We appreciate and note your willingness to travel here and answer our questions. First, in a private setting in September, and now in a public setting. Google is one of the most valuable companies in America because of what it does. Google's search engine organizes the entire internet, and by extension, almost all the information in the world. This is hardly an exaggeration. Here is a statistic you will hear a lot today, but it bears repeating. According to the Wall Street Journal, 90% of all internet searches go through Google. That is power, and it comes with responsibility. Mr. Pichai, it was necessary to convene this hearing because of the widening gap of distrust between technology companies and the American people. For our country and economy to grow stronger, the American people must be able to have trust in the great companies of the 21st century. We can alleviate some of their concerns today with transparency and candor. I hope we can begin to restore trust in the technology companies that shape our world, but we need answers. We need to know first that Google is committed to the free market ideals of competition and entrepreneurship that launched its revolutionary products to begin with. Second, we need to be sure that any political bias within Google's workforce does not creep into its search products. Third, we need to know that Google is living up to America's belief in free expression and human rights when it deals with foreign governments. Now, a word on the last subject. Right now, Google reportedly is developing a censored search engine with the Chinese Communist Party. It is also developing next-generation technology on Chinese soil and in conjunction with Chinese national champions like Tencent. Technology that the administration considers a national priority. Now, this news raises a troubling possibility that Google is being used to strengthen China's system of surveillance, repression, and control. Right this very second, China's authoritarian system detains more than 1 million religious minorities in re-education camps. Mr. Pichai, I urge you to reflect on that fact and on the promise your company made when it pulled out of the China market in 2010. And I applauded you for that move in 2010. Back then, Google promised it would not censor its search results in China or compromise its commitment to a free and open internet. Now, in light of these recent events, I think the American people deserve to know, is something changed? And if so, what? All of these topics, competition, censorship, bias, and others, point to one fundamental question that demands the nation's attention. Are America's technology companies serving as instruments of freedom or instruments of control? Are they fulfilling the promise of the digital age? Are they advancing the cause of self-government? Or are they serving as instruments of manipulation, used by powerful interests and foreign governments to rob the people of their power, agency, and dignity? I believe we need to grapple with these questions together as a nation. Because the free world depends on a free internet. We need to know that Google is on the side of the free world, and that it will provide its services free of anti-competitive behavior, political bias, and censorship. I want to thank you again for being here and answering these questions. I look forward to listening to the answers with a very open mind, and I yield back.
I'd now like to invite Mr. Pichai to take his seat at the witness table.